So now we are in our week 3, so welcome back. And so this week we are going to talk more about industrial hygienes, which is the fourth part of the continuations of last week classes. Last week we talked about toxicologies and how toxicants enter our body, how toxicants leave our body, and what is the effects of these toxicants onto our body. So this week we will talk about how do we identify, how do we evaluate, and how do we control the environment's toxicants. Industry and society are continue to focus on reductions of personnel and environmental damage resulting from accidents. Many of these accidents in this area are due to civil concern and ethics, sometimes manifested in laws and regulation. So in this chapter, we describe the relationships between law and regulations as an introduction to industrial hygiene. Industrial hygiene is a science devoted to the identification, evaluations, and control of the occupational conditions that cause sickness and injury. Industrial hygienists are also responsible for selecting and using instrumentations to monitor the workplace during the identifications and control phase of the industrial hygiene projects. Following are the industrial hygiene project example, such as monitoring toxic airborne vapor concentrations, the reductions of the toxic airborne vapor through the use of ventilations, selecting proper PPE, developing proper procedures or SOP/SOC for handling hazardous material, monitoring and reductions of noise, heat, radiations, etc. And all these projects with one aim to ensure the workers are not exposed to the harmful level. Typically, there are 4 phases of industrial hygiene projects. They are anticipations, meaning the expectations of the presence of workplace hazards and worker exposures. The next one is identifications, to look at what is the presence of the workplace exposure. Then followed by evaluations, to look at the magnitude of the exposure. And of course, once we have all this data, the next thing, which is the most important thing, is the control on how we apply this control to reduce the workplace exposure to the accepted level. In chemical plants and laboratories, the industrial hygienists work very closely with safety professionals as an integral part of safety and loss prevention program. After identifying and evaluating the hazards, the industrial hygienists make recommendations relevant to control techniques. The industrial hygienists, safety professionals, and plant operations personnel work together to ensure that the control measures are applied and maintained. It has been clearly demonstrated that the toxic chemicals can be handled safely when principles of industrial hygiene are appropriately applied. Laws and regulations are the major tools for protecting people and the environment. So our parliaments are responsible for passing laws that governs Malaysia's government, and to put these laws into enforcement, and these departments are actually authorized to come up with the acts to protect the people and environment, such as Department of Environment, DOE, Department of Occupational Safety and Health, DOSH, and also Malaysia's Ministry of Home Affairs, which, if you look at the counterpart in US Congress authorized certain government organizations to pass the laws and regulations, which you can see the counterpart for DOE will be EPA, the counterpart for DOSH in US will be OSHA, and the counterpart for Ministry of Home Affairs is US Departments of Homeland Security. The reasons I'm introducing the US government's organization here is because a lot of our act and our law or the safety acts in Malaysia are based off what US have. After the law is official, how do we put them into practice? What happens is that law often do not include the details for compliance. To make a law works on a day-to-day levels, the governments actually authorize certain governmental organizations such as EPA and OSHA, or in Malaysia it will be DOE and DOSH, to create regulations and standards. Regulations set specific rules about what is legal and what is not legal. For example, a regulations relevant to the Clean Air Act will specify levels of specific toxic chemicals that are safe, quantities of the toxic chemical that are legally emitted into the air, and what penalties are given if the legal limits are being exceeded. So after the regulations is in effect, the EPA or the DOE would then has the responsibility to help citizens or to help companies to comply with the law and also to enforce the regulation. So in these slides, you can see that OSHA has certain right of enforcement when it comes to compliance or it comes to taking actions. So first of all, if the OSHA's official comes to the door site, the employers of the company must admit these OSHA compliance officers into their plant site for safety inspections with no advance notice. A search warrant can be may be required to show probable cause, but it's not needed. So meaning any times that the OSHAs want to come for a spot check, the employers or the company must allow them to go in to take a look. And second is the OSHA rights of inspections includes any and all safety and health records, including training, safety trainings, including the health checks records, and if let's say people who are working in radiations areas, so they will have to have a track records of their health screening records in terms of radiation. And so if the company failed to comply to any of these rules and regulations or fail to show provide those records, a criminal penalties can be invoked immediately. In the events, if the OSHA officers find that the conditions is dangerous for workers or is dangerous to environment, they can actually order an immediate plant shutdown. On February 24, 1992, OSHA published the final rules for process safety management of highly hazardous chemicals. This standard is performance-oriented, that is, to set general requirements for the management of hazardous chemical. Process Safety Management (PSM) was developed after Bhopal accidents in 1985 to prevent similar accidents. It is recognized by industry and the government as an excellent regulation that will reduce the number and magnitude of accidents if it is understood and practiced as intended. The PSM has 14 major sections, as you can see from the slides here, including or starting from employee involvement, process safety information, process hazard analysis, operating procedures, training, contractors, pre-startup safety review, mechanical integrity, hot work permit, management of change, incidents investigations, emergency planning and response, compliance audit, and trade secrets. So we are going to explain sections by sections, so please bear with me. First, the first elements of PSM, as you can see here, is the employee involvement, or we call employee participations, which it requires active employee participations in all major elements of the PSM, and employers must develop and document a plan of actions to specify this participation. Second is process safety information. So this is the second one. This is the first one. And process safety information is compiled and made available for all employees to facilitate the understanding and identifications of hazards. This information includes block flow diagrams or process flow diagram, the process chemistry, the process limitations such as the temperatures, the pressures, flows, and compositions. And also the consequences of process derivations are also required. This process safety information is needed before training, before the process hazard analysis and management of change. And the third one is process hazard analysis. It has to be performed by a team of experts, including engineers, chemists, operators, industrial hygienists, and other appropriate and experienced specialists. The PHA, process hazard analysis, also what we call it short as PHA, needs to include a method that fits the complexity of the process. For example, a hazard study for a complex process, which we are going to talk more about hazard analysis in chapter 5. Or for a less complex process, such as we can use what if scenario, or we can use simple checklist, or we can use failure mode and effect analysis. Some of you may have heard about this before. What we call in short is FMEA, or fault tree analysis. We are going to cover fault tree analysis in chapter 11. And employers must ensure that the recommendations from the PHA are acted on a timely manner. Every PSM process needs an updated PHA at least every 5 years. So meaning if we are going to do this, every 5 years, we need a process review or a process safety review. The moments we have done with process safety informations plus process hazard analysis, and it is our job as an engineer to then develop the operating procedures to facilitate the safe operations of the plant. And these instructions has to be very clear, and of course the first rule of thumb is to keep it simple. Okay? And even though we say we want to keep it simple, it has to cover a lot of processes, including what you need to do with initial startup, normal operations, what are the operating procedures, and here we are not just talking about SOP, we also have to include the SOC as well, standard operating procedures and standard operating conditions. And also, of course, beside this one, we also need to include temporary operations. We also have to include emergency shutdown, normal shutdown, startup after normal and emergency shutdown, and also consequences of derivation, meaning if let's say anything go beyond SOC. For example, the vessel is supposed to run at 400 degrees Celsius, but now it is running at 600 degrees Celsius. What do you want the operator to do? Okay, and also we also have to specify down what is the hazardous properties of the chemical, the exposure precautions, the engineering and administrative control, etc. Safe work practice has to be documented, such as hot work, lockout, tagout, and confined spaces. All these operating procedures has to be updated frequently, and with frequently being set by operating personnel. And An effective training program helps employees to understand the hazards associated with the tasks that they perform. Maintenance and operational personnel receive three things. One is initial training, and then they also have to go for refresher training. So operators need to understand the hazards associated with every task, including emergency shutdown, startup, and normal operations. Refresher training is given every 3 years and more often if necessary. Operators or the management will then decide on the frequency of the refresher trainings for the operators. The next one we are going to talk about is contractor. Contractors are trained to perform their tasks safely to the same extent as employees. Even when you are selecting contractors, the employees need to consider the contractor's safety performance in addition to their skill. A pre-startup safety review is a special safety review that is conducted after a modifications to the process or operating conditions has been changed and before the startup. In this review, a team of reviewers has to ensure that first, the system is constructed in accordance to the design specification. Second, the safety, maintenance, operating, and emergency procedures are in place. And third, the appropriate training is completed. And fourth, the recommendations from the PHA are implemented or resolved. The mechanical integrity sections of the PSM standard ensures that the equipment, piping, relief systems, control, and alarms are mechanically sound and operational. The requirements include, first, a written procedures to maintain functioning system, training regarding preventive maintenance, periodic inspections and testing based on vendor recommendation, a process to correct deficiencies, and a process to ensure that all equipment and spare parts are suitable. The PSM standard ascertains that a system is in place to prepare and issue hot work permits before conducting any hot work activities such as welding, grinding, or any using spark producing equipment. The permit requires date authorized to work, the equipment involved in the work, a system to maintain the documents of certification, the identifications of openings where sparks may drop, the types of numbers of fire extinguishers, the identifications of fire watches, and inspections before work, authorization signatures, identifications of flammable materials in the area, and of course, verifications that the surrounding area is not explosive, verifications that the combustion materials are removed or covered appropriately, identifications and closures of any open vessels or ducts, and verifications that welded walls are not flammable. Under the management of change sections, the PSM standards employees are required to develop and implement documented procedures to manage changes in the process chemistry, equipment, and operating procedures. Before a change occurs, it must be reviewed to ascertain that it will not affect the safety of the operations. After the change has been made, all the affected employees are then have to be retrained and the pre-startup review is required to be conducted. The PSM standard mandates incident investigation. Employers must investigate all incidents that have or could have resulted in a major release or accidents within 48 hours of the event. The regulations requires an investigation team composed of people, including operators who are knowledgeable about the system. After the investigations, the employers are required to appropriately use the investigation's recommendation. The intent of the PSM elements for emergency planning and response is to require employer to respond effectively to the release of highly hazardous chemicals. Although the regulations require these activities for companies with more than 10 employees, this element should be part of the programs or even for the smallest organizations that handle hazardous chemicals. Under the audit sections of the PSM standard, employers are required to certify that they have evaluated their compliance with the standards at least every 3 years. The recommendations from the audit must be followed. The audit report needs to be retained as long as the process exists. Last one is the trade secret sessions of the PSM standard is to ensure that all contractors are given all the information relevant to the operating of the plant safety. Some personnel may need to sign secrecy agreements or what we call the NDA, non-disclosure agreement, before they receive this information.